Hello and welcome to Curious About Bitcoin. I'm your host, Brian Rothenberg. It's been several weeks since I posted a video. I'm sorry about that. And I thank those of you who've reached out to me asking for me to cover additional topics and wondering when my next video is going to come. Truth is that I kind of got ahead of myself with the number of videos I was putting out for a couple of weeks there in early June. Then I got bogged down with some other obligations I had and some travel, and that put me behind the eight ball. So this is going to be a little bit of a housekeeping update at the beginning of this video, and then I'm going to get into some treasury analysis. So first thing that I'm going to do is talk about some slight changes that I'm going to make to this channel. So Curious About Bitcoin was always meant to be a Bitcoin channel for beginners to give them information about Bitcoin. And while I've done one or two videos on those topics, most of my videos so far have been about treasury companies, which I also find extremely interesting and do want to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate out my content into two channels. I have another channel, Brian Rothenberg, that I'm going to move all of my Treasuries content to and start updating Treasuries content there. And I'm going to do so at least once a week going forward. So I'm making that commitment. This channel, Curious About Bitcoin, will focus on Bitcoin itself. It may cover treasuries to a limited extent, but more for beginners and less sort of in-depth as I've been doing in a lot of my videos and what we'll do in the second part of the video here today. So that's where we're going. I also intend to move all of the videos that I have uploaded on Curious About Bitcoin that deal with treasuries over to my Brian Rothenberg channel. And I'll be sure to update that in the show notes here once everything's moved over, probably over the next week. But basically giving you a commitment to doing at least two videos a week, one on treasuries and one on Bitcoin itself, mainly for beginners, as I intended to upfront. So wanted to provide that update. The second thing that I wanted to do today is go over some thoughts I had about how we can think about comparing Bitcoin treasury companies. And this has been something that's been somewhat hotly debated on X, and a number of people have their own opinions about it, but we're still very early and we're figuring these things out. So I've come up with a small framework, I guess, or a framework that explains parts of these things and have some numbers that I want to walk through. I don't know that these are right. This is also not financial advice. This is financial entertainment or edutainment at best, but certainly do not make any decisions based on any of the analysis I do here. Definitely do your own research, but research is meant to be a team sport. Investing is an individual sport as we go through. So I'm going to share my screen and start with basically four phases that I want to personally think about Bitcoin treasury companies in. And this is certainly subject to change, but overall, I think we have four distinct phases and there are key metrics for each. So the first phase is the liftoff phase. This is the early companies, and we'll give you some examples in the next tab in just a moment. But these are the ones that are brand new to stacking Bitcoin and doing a treasury strategy, issuing shares or debt to get Bitcoin. And the key metric for this phase is MNAV months to cover. If they're doing multiple accretions of Bitcoin, how long is it going to take them to cover their MNAV? Because MNAVs can run very high as people pile into this stock in certain markets and things like that around the world, as we've seen a little bit of, and I expect to see more of in certain markets in the future. That's phase one. Phase two is the growth phase, and there are a number of companies potentially in this phase as well. And the key metric here is BTC yield. How much Bitcoin are they adding to the balance sheet compared to the Bitcoin that they started with over different time periods? So the key metric there is going to be growth. The third phase is torque. And within phase three here, BTC torque is kind of what I would measure here. This is when companies start to use other types of instruments to get more Bitcoin. I think we're just starting to see what this is going to look like with preferred shares from Strategy. We hopefully will see some preferred shares from Semler and probably from Metaplanet in the coming months. You may also have operational businesses that can, add dollars to, or fiat rather would be a better term, to the bottom line that could then be reinvested into Bitcoin for that company. But this torque phase is making sure that we're moving away from things that yield and accrete more Bitcoin, but are doing so in a smarter way that isn't diluting shareholders as much and gets more accretive over time. And so that's kind of the phase three piece. And then the phase four piece is the value piece or the yield piece. How are we going to monetize all this Bitcoin on the balance sheet? And here's my thesis for this. We have yet to see any companies in phase four And maybe we'll start to see this with earnings this quarter when they're reported by some of the companies in the space. But I still think another quarter or two before people really start to understand this. If we are looking at this, in these different phases, we have to think about kind of different companies in different phases and how we would value them. But also, what are the overall goals here? If we're just looking for the fastest horse and the quickest run up and trying to speculate or gamble, certainly we should be focusing on the phase one. I had a company that did, 200% in one day in terms of what it added, but it gave a lot of that back, right? I saw that previously with another company that's, in a different phase there. If you want to look at growth, then certainly how much they're yielding over time will matter, but it's still probably a trader mentality if you're thinking only in that way, where, when the BTC yield comes down as, things compress with the MNAV, that's probably going to want you to rotate out into a faster horse there. And I'm not saying that that's a wrong strategy for anyone, because again, you're doing your own thing, but when we're trying to compare these companies, we needed to have a better structure to do that. And different companies will be in different phases. In phase three, we want to see them increase that torque. I'm using the term that Michael Saylor put out as he's talking about the preferred instrument strategy has. And that's not the only way to do this. And we're going to see some unique things in the future, I'm sure, from other companies. Some of the torque features will probably be things like the options trading that Metaplanet is doing on Bitcoin itself that's going to give additional revenue to the company that can be used to pay dividends on preferreds or pay down debt or even just buy Bitcoin, right? I would call that a different type of torque as well. And then when we get to the yield phase, this is where we're looking at things like earnings per share, MNAV, if there's going to be yield by opening up lightning channels with your Bitcoin or loaning it out other ways or tokenizing your stock in some way. So that could be a tradable instrument based on the Bitcoin there. I have no idea what this is going to look like. I don't even know how half that stuff will work, but I don't think we've seen any of that yet, is my point. And so we have different companies in different phases of growth here. And growth is probably a bad term, but different phases of the Bitcoin Treasury, I don't know, continuum, if you will, starting out. And maybe there'll be more phases, a phase five, phase six, who knows? So what I started to do next is try to put some companies into different phases. And I'm going to start with phase three because that's the easiest. When we're looking at things like BTC Torque, certainly we see strategy kind of ratcheting this up the most with their preferred offerings. There are other things that I've mentioned for Metaplanet, for example, with the options trading that they're doing. Maybe you could count that as Torque, but I think we're going to see a little bit more from Metaplanet, say over the next quarter, that might move them over to, phase three, or at least put them on the line down here. Same thing with Semler. They talked to just today, they have a shareholder meeting in September to potentially issue preferred shares and start using those. I'm not saying that that's going to put them in the torque category, but I think that they're trying to move over here to the growth category for sure. And maybe another quarter after that, maybe they get into torque. Maybe it takes longer. Who knows, right? Cooler has been around for a while. They've shown again that they're, getting away and they're doing, constructive buys and everything like that. And SWC is pretty new, so kind of in this liftoff phase, but they've been showing the growth and maybe the yields are something that they should be looking at as well. And certainly the blockchain group, I think, belongs in the growth phase here. These other companies are newer. And so with them, and I tried to put them in alphabetical order and I just realized I didn't. But point being that these are really in the liftoff phase for those companies there for sure. And even some of these other companies here could potentially be considered in phase one as well. Again, this is just a framework I came up with today. And who am I but some guy on YouTube telling you what he thinks about these companies? And so there are different ways that we want to think about them over time and what we expect from them in the future, the risk adjusted returns and where they're going, right? And people will have different investment theses for these different companies based on if they're looking at it just as a growth company, just in a liftoff phase, moving into the torque phase, or even if they plan to hold for a long time as an investor into phase four or whatever comes in the future. So what I did next, and I will say that I copped out a little bit and only did two companies, and this is not meant to be, a head-to-head or anything like that. There were some debates about these two companies on X over the weekend, but basically looking at some of these earnings per share, metrics for Metaplanet and MSTR. And so I took values from Roy Ragner's analysis that he had on July 5th for share counts. I took the share price on June 30th, and I tried to make some, baseline assumptions based on history, because this is all backwards looking data that does not include today's buys on July 7th that each company did. So we've got, fully diluted shares outstanding, share price, Bitcoin held, all of these pieces, what the MNAV is for their the NAV is for their Bitcoin, the average acquisition cost. You'll notice here that it's much greater for Metaplanet, which makes sense because they've acquired a lot more of their stack overall in Q2 than Strategy did. They got, 550, was it, somewhere in that neighborhood, 1,000 Bitcoin that was acquired before Q2. So that's going to have a lower acquisition cost, and that's going to affect the price appreciation that they experienced, and ultimately the earnings that they experience off that as well. When you break all this down, you see that we're going to get an earnings per share estimate here. And this is where I think, some of the people who are looking at Bitcoin yield as the only metric are kind of limiting themselves a little bit in how they're thinking about these companies. Earnings per share is not going to magically compress fully on the MSTR side and expand on the Metaplanet side until they're at parity because of the yield. It will take time to do that. I mean, one of the other key metrics, and I pointed this out on past videos, Metaplanet has twice as many assumed fully diluted shares out there as MSTR. The stock price in MSTR is a lot higher than it is for Metaplanet, but like you're not exactly comparing things the same way here. And they are, in my opinion, in different phases. For sure, Metaplanet's in the growth phase and Strategy's in the torque phase. And I don't think that Metaplanet is yet in the torque phase. That's my opinion. And I'm going to stick by it because this is my channel and nobody else is here to argue it with me. But if you have other thoughts, share them, because we're all trying to make each other better and have sharp analysis about how we want to allocate our funds here. But overall, if you then take all of these numbers and you put it into a price to earnings ratio today, you'd see the MSTR is trading at about a 9 and Metaplanet is trading at about a 70 price to earnings ratio. So a big difference there. I will also say, and this again is not financial advice, I put more money into Metaplanet today, and I have not invested more funds into Strategy for many weeks now. And in fact, I have started selling certain treasury companies, and I'll go into more detail on that in another video. But previously, I'd said I was only a net acquirer, and I have changed that perspective a little bit. Not quite into a trader's mindset, but I'll explain more about that later. Again, this doesn't matter, but it does, here when I'm pointing out these numbers, I just want to point out that I'm bullish on Metaplanet. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the company that's going to take my investment and, potentially have an easier time, let's say tripling it in the next quarter or the next 2 quarters. And getting Metaplanet to $33 versus getting Strategy to $1,200. I think the Metaplanet, the $30 is a much easier lift in that short-term time frame. And I've maintained that. And I've said that to people probably since the Bitcoin conference, if not sooner. So that's this quarter's numbers. Now I want to take this out and project to what would happen in certain circumstances in Q3 of this year. And there's a lot of moving parts here, and I've had to make simplified assumptions. It's potentially a model. I'm not going to say this is perfect by any stretch, but here goes with that model. The top part up here, exactly the same as the prior page. Here at the bottom, what I did is I assumed a quarter end Bitcoin price of 150,000. What we'll see is that basically if you increase the Bitcoin price, it's going to favor Strategy because, they have a bigger stack and everything like that. So the average acquisition cost is going to be lower. And that's going to maintain forever, basically, because they're going to be starting from a higher base until Metaplanet gets, 600,000 Bitcoin to match what Strategy has at that time, which is probably going to be very difficult to do in the short term. Said that basically Strategy is going to yield 10% more Bitcoin over the quarter. And I'm going to assume that Metaplanet hits 50,000 Bitcoin. Mind you, Metaplanet has said that they're aiming in their 555 plan for 30,000 Bitcoin by the end of 4. So I'm basically projecting more than that just in Q3. Like they're super bullish there. And it's basically a Bitcoin yield of 275%. So again, I'm trying to give basically Metaplanet as much benefit as possible with these projections. So this is the average quarterly acquisition cost. This is just basically the difference between 150 and 107. And let's assume that it was a stair step and it just went up, progressively throughout the quarter. It's too hard to model, other things. And I'm just trying to kind of get some, roundabout numbers to show what could happen here. So the average acquisition cost for strategy, 109,000, average acquisition cost for Metaplanet, 123,000, which makes sense because Metaplanet has 50,000 Bitcoin at the end of this, and they acquired, 36,000 of them in this quarter somewhere, right? And then 13,000 at prior prices of, carrying cost at 107 there. Whereas strategy acquired 10% more than they had at 107,000. So it, doesn't move the needle nearly as much there. This is going to matter because at the end, we're going to multiply the total Bitcoin by 150,000 to figure out what is the price appreciation overall in terms of the earnings here. And you can see blowout earnings potentially here as we kind of continue this up in the trajectory. As I continue down here, I assumed MNAV of 1.75 for strategy. Some might argue that that's too high. I think that that's in line, especially with strategy using the preferreds, and keep going as I go next. And I gave Metaplanet an MNAV of 8. Right now it's at a 4 to 5. So I'm being generous with that as I go through. I tried to calculate basically the new assumed fully diluted shares after they purchased all of this Bitcoin with common shares. I mentioned before that strategy is in the torque phase. So I don't think that, strategy is going to use common shares solely for this purpose. But again, I'm just trying to have some kind of, fair, analysis that is somewhat putting these things head to head as much as possible. How much does the Bitcoin increase in value in terms of, a 39% increase in the Bitcoin price from 107 to 150 based on, the MNAVs there, basically the diluted shares are going to, tell you where we're going for price adjustments for these companies. And you can see strategy goes from 404 to 681 and Metaplanet, teleports to $46 a share, under this, the way that I'm looking at how much they're grabbing here. And then you're going to get to the new fully diluted shares that we're going to have post this acquisition in Q2, going up by 100 million for Metaplanet, going up by 10 million for MSTR. Metaplanet has more than twice the shares of MSTR, but if you're looking at this, we're going from 1.4 billion Bitcoin, value. We're adding 4.7 billion there, and this is just a small fraction of the 64 billion that strategy previously had. So I feel like, again, if anything, I'm stacking the deck on Metaplanet's side here. Overall, the NAV for the Bitcoin at the end of the quarter is, 98 billion for strategy and 7.5 billion for Metaplanet. The price appreciation on their Bitcoin is, going to be more for strategy because they had a lower average acquisition cost. And then you get to the earnings and it blows out the 14 billion up here to 26 billion, but it's an order of magnitude more for Metaplanet. It goes from 132 million to 1.3 billion dollars in earnings. And this was all dollar adjusted. I didn't say that for the yen price on 630 for the share price up here. Finally, earnings per share, you could see up here that it was 44.70. It's now going to almost double there for strategy. For Metaplanet, it goes from 16 to, 44. Again, it's an almost an order of magnitude greater. And you can see the compressions for the PE ratio for both companies, but much more compression for Metaplanet. But they're adding $1.44 per share in terms of earnings versus, how much you're getting for strategy here. And it's just a much different number overall in terms of what we're doing there. And I suppose one more thing I suppose we could do is, when we're looking at the price to earnings, I guess the price to earnings is doing what I was trying to do there with the extra line. But this is showing us for the share price, how much are you paying extra for some of these things? And you can see it coming down for Metaplanet as it kind of matures on the phases structure here from maybe growth to torque, but it's not fully down and there's just a lot accreting there. And these types of earnings per share ratios getting much higher is the kind of thing that we're going to be looking for, I think, in the value yield phase. TBD in the future there. If we decrease the price, it somewhat helps Metaplanet, but it's still kind of a blowout because some of these things don't work quite as well for them, but the compression isn't nearly as big. If you go to 200,000 at the end of the quarter, you can see that the compression is bigger here and the earnings per share is bigger. But look at strategies, right? It goes from 44 to 178, and it's a $57 billion earnings. This is crazy. And so these are some of the things that I think, the people who are, very much still along the long-term thesis for strategy are thinking about. Whereas the people who are looking at the thesis for Metaplanet, they're looking at things in a different way. But you look at the share price, right? So average share price for purchases for strategy, it's $1,000 in this case, where Bitcoin went to 200,000 and you're yielding 10%. If you yield more, then, and I don't have that fully baked in there, so I can't just change that, that price will go up. But you're taking, basically a 8x on the stock price of Metaplanet, and you're, 1.5x on the stock price for strategy in the short term. And so this is kind of where, the people on the Metaplanet side, I think, really do have something there, and why I'm putting more money into it, because this is going to be the faster, more creative horse, over the next quarter, probably in terms of the stock price increasing. But over the long term, geez, right? Like, you're going to see a ton of money pour into strategy here. And I have to think that this is going to be a very, very low share price. Like, I'd be probably fully porting into strategy at this share price because it's based on an MNAV of 1.75. Like, the rest of people in time aren't looking at the, earnings as being the largest earnings in quarterly history if Bitcoin ends the quarter at 200,000. With these, 10% yields, with this MNAV of 1.75 times for strategy. Again, these are very conservative numbers for strategy and probably pretty aggressive numbers for Metaplanet. So this is kind of the framework that I'm thinking of. I'm not ready to fully port into one or another. I bought, more shares of two other companies today, actually four. I started a couple positions in a few others as well. But point being here that there's a lot to think about. And if you just want one metric, I think you are here, a speculator, here a trader, here you start to be, someone who might be investing, but you have to look at sort of the longer term play, and everybody can do whatever they want. If you just want to, make a quick, hit of 100% return and get out quickly, and you're going to monitor that throughout the day or set up limit orders, great. If you just want to ride the yield and then go into the next fastest player after that, great. But different people here, I think, have different investment theses and different timeframes that they're looking at those theses. And that's the thing that I think has been missing a little bit from the analysis here. So that's everything that I wanted to share today in this video. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback, let me know. Again, you will see more content on this channel specifically around Bitcoin and mainly aimed at beginners. And you'll see all of these videos on treasury companies and things like that going to my personal YouTube channel. But I will be posting to each channel at least once a week here going forward. And I hope you all will continue to watch these videos and you got something out of them. Thank you again and have a great day.